I used to believe that silence was a form of respect, that if I worked hard, stayed grateful, and never complained, the people closest to me would eventually see my worth. I believed family meant protection. I believed trust didn't need receipts. I was wrong. The day my name was called on a graduation stage in the United States after years of late nights, unpaid internships, and careful saving, there was one empty seat that mattered more than all the applause. At the same time, somewhere else, balloons were rising, music was playing, and my money was being spent like it never belonged to me. I didn't scream. I didn't confront anyone publicly. I didn't ruin the party. I watched. I remembered. I saved everything. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits. And when it finally comes, it doesn't ask for permission. If you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, take a moment to comment your location and local time. I'd like to know you're here with me. And if stories about quiet strength and delayed justice speak to you, consider subscribing. You're not alone, even when it feels that way. I learned very early how to take up as little space as possible. Not because anyone ever told me to be quiet, but because silence was the only way to survive without being accused of being difficult. In my family, peace was maintained by the person who complained the least, and that person was always me. My name is Emily Carter. I grew up in a small suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, in a house that looked ordinary in every way that mattered to outsiders. 2 cars in the driveway, holiday decorations on time, family dinners that appeared warm enough if you stayed long enough to see the table but not long enough to notice who did most of the listening. My mother Linda was not cruel in obvious ways. She didn't shout, she didn't hit, she didn't abandon me. What she did was subtler and much harder to explain to anyone who wasn't living inside it. She loved unevenly. I was her first child. The one who arrived when she was young, careful, and still trying to prove herself. I grew up learning rules quickly. Clean your room before being asked. Don't waste food. Don't interrupt adults. Be grateful. Always be grateful. When I was 12, my half-brother Jason was born from my mother's second marriage. Everything changed quietly after that. The house didn't move. The routines didn't collapse. But the emotional center of gravity shifted in a way I couldn't name at the time. Jason cried and someone came running. I struggled and I was told I was strong. Jason needed help with homework, and my mother sat beside him for hours. I figured it out on my own and was praised for being so independent. People think independence is a gift. Sometimes it's just neglect wrapped in a compliment. By the time I reached high school, I had already internalized a dangerous belief needing less made me easier to love. So I learned to need nothing. I kept my grades high around a 3.9 gigapascals, not because I dreamed of valedictorian speeches, but because excellence felt safer than asking for help. I worked part-time after school at a grocery store, then added weekend shifts at a cafe. I saved every paycheck, not for anything specific, just to know I could. At home, Jason's life moved in the opposite direction. He forgot assignments, switched interests constantly, needed reminders for everything. My mother hovered around him in a way she never had with me. She excused his mistakes, defended him fiercely, paid for things without explanation. When I noticed the difference, I said nothing. Silence became my language. College was my way out, but it wasn't a clean escape. I attended a state university about 3 hours away, far enough to breathe, close enough to remain emotionally tethered. I earned scholarships, small grants, and worked multiple campus jobs. I didn't want to owe anyone anything. Every dollar mattered. I tracked expenses obsessively. Rent, utilities, gas, groceries. I learned how to survive on $40 a week when I had to. I learned how to smile through exhaustion because complaining felt like weakness. Meanwhile, Jason stayed home. He enrolled in a local college, changed majors twice, dropped classes, re-enrolled. My mother paid his tuition, paid his car insurance, paid for things I never asked about because I already knew the answer. Whenever people praised me, my mother smiled proudly. "Emily has always been easy," she'd say. "She doesn't need much." I smiled too because that was easier than explaining that I didn't ask because no one was listening. By my senior year, something shifted. I secured an internship contract with a consulting firm in Chicago, $22 an hour, with a written pathway toward a full-time offer after graduation. For the first time in my life, my future felt solid. Not hopeful, solid. Around that time, several things happened at once. My final scholarship refund came through. My internship savings grew. My final semester stipend cleared. Altogether, I had accumulated a little over $18,000. To someone else, it might have been extra money. To me, it was 4 years of discipline made visible. Every skipped meal, every late shift, every time I told myself, just get through this semester. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post about it. I didn't even tell anyone, except my mother. She asked casually, during one of our calls, how I was planning to handle moving after graduation. I mentioned the savings briefly, gave her the number. Her tone changed immediately, lighter, more interested. "That's really impressive," she said. "I'm proud of you. You've always been smart with money." I wanted to believe that. At the time, there was a technical issue with the refund. Because of how the university processed it, part of the money passed through a joint account my mother had helped me open years earlier. It was supposed to be temporary, a matter of logistics. I didn't think twice. Trust rarely does. In the weeks leading up to graduation, I was overwhelmed. Final exams, exit interviews, packing my apartment, planning the move. I slept 4 hours a night, if that. My mother called occasionally, sounding distracted but upbeat. I assumed she was busy planning to attend my graduation. I imagined her in the crowd. I imagined her clapping when my name was called. I imagined for once not scanning the audience and feeling that familiar emptiness. Looking back, that hope feels almost embarrassing, because while I was finalizing presentations and printing resumes, something else was being prepared without my knowledge, without my consent, and with my money. I didn't know it yet. But the role I had played my entire life, the quiet one, the understanding one, the daughter who didn't demand, was about to be used as justification. And my graduation, the moment I had worked toward for years, was already being quietly replaced. The money didn't appear all at once. It arrived the way my independence always had, slowly, quietly, piece by piece, without anyone clapping for it. For 4 years, every financial decision I made was filtered through one question: will this keep me free later? Freedom to me wasn't luxury. It was the ability to say no, to walk away, to never have to beg. I worked during semesters and full-time during summers. I took the early shifts no one wanted. I accepted contracts that paid less but offered experience. I skipped spring break trips. I bought used textbooks, then sold them back for half of what I paid. I lived with roommates I barely liked because they were cheaper. I tracked expenses down to the dollar. By my senior year, my spreadsheet had become a habit, not obsessive necessary. The biggest portion of the money came from 3 sources. First, there was the scholarship refund. I had received more aid than my final semester required, and the university returned the unused amount. Second, there were my internship earnings, steady, taxed, predictable. Third, there was a small stipend from a research assistant position I'd held during my final year. None of it was sudden. None of it was gifted. Altogether, it totaled $18,247.36. I remember the exact number because I stared at it for a long time when it finally settled. It felt unreal, not because it was a fortune, but because it represented proof. Proof that patience could become something tangible. Proof that I wasn't foolish for believing in the long game. That money had a purpose. It was my relocation fund, security deposit, first month's rent, emergency buffer. It meant I wouldn't have to call home if something went wrong. It meant I wouldn't owe anyone gratitude they could later cash in. I never planned to give it to anyone. I never planned to share it. And I certainly never planned for it to disappear. The only reason my mother had any connection to it at all was administrative. When I was 17, she helped me open a joint checking account. At the time, it made sense. I was a minor. She handled paperwork. I trusted her. Over time, I opened my own accounts and moved most of my finances there. The joint account became inactive, something that existed on paper more than in practice. When the scholarship refund was processed, the university sent it to that older account by default. I noticed it when the notification came through. I told myself I'd transfer it later. I was busy. Finals were approaching. Everything felt urgent. I didn't think of it as accessible. I thought of it as temporary. I didn't consider that access doesn't expire just because trust does. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden empty balance or a frantic alert. It was a feeling subtle, almost dismissible. My mother started asking questions she'd never asked before. How much did you say that refund was again? Are you keeping most of your money in savings or checking? Do you need help managing things when you move? Her tone was gentle, curious. Maternal? I answered honestly. I always had. Looking back, I can see the shift. At the time, I mistook it for interest. A week later, she mentioned that Jason's birthday was coming up. He was turning 21. She talked about it casually, the way she talked about weather or grocery prices. She said he'd had a hard year, that he deserved something special. I listened. I said nothing. She didn't ask for money. She didn't hint. She didn't mention budgets or costs. If she had, I might have noticed. I might have said something. But she didn't need to ask. Because from her perspective, the money wasn't really mine. It was family money. It was extra. It was something I didn't need right away. Something I was good with. People justify a lot when they think someone won't push back. In the days that followed, my mother became harder to reach. When we did talk, she sounded busy, excited even. I assumed she was juggling work. Or planning travel for my graduation. I didn't check my account. Not because I was careless, but because I was overwhelmed. My days were filled with deadlines and decisions. My nights were spent packing boxes and saying quiet goodbyes to a version of my life that had been built entirely on survival. The money felt safe. It was numbers on a screen. It wasn't going anywhere. I didn't know then that the decision had already been made for me. The withdrawal happened in pieces. Not one large transaction, but several smaller ones. Payments to vendors, transfers, cash withdrawals, each one justifiable on its own, together devastating. At the time, I wasn't watching closely enough to notice. Trust has blind spots. My mother never told me she was using the money. She never warned me. She never paused to ask whether I needed it sooner than expected. She didn't consider what it would mean to me because she had already decided that my needs were flexible. That was the pattern after all. I was the one who adjusted, who waited, who understood. What she didn't account for was this understanding is not the same as consent. By the time I finally logged in and saw the balance, the story had already been written. The money was gone. Not misplaced. Not delayed. Spent. And the realization that followed wasn't just financial. It was personal. Because the same trust I had built my independence on the belief that staying quiet kept me safe had just been used against me. I didn't find out about the party because someone told me. I found out because the house started changing its rhythm. In the weeks leading up to my graduation, my mother's phone calls became shorter but more frequent. She'd call while driving, while walking into a store, while in the middle of something. Her voice carried a lightness I wasn't used to hearing when the topic was me. She laughed more. She rushed less. I assumed foolishly that it had something to do with my graduation. She asked vague questions, the kind that feel thoughtful on the surface but never lead anywhere real. What time is your ceremony again? How many people can attend? Do they live stream it? I answered patiently as I always did. I emailed her the link to the university's commencement page, sent her the schedule, even forwarded the parking instructions knowing she hated navigating campuses. She thanked me, said I'll figure it out. I held on to that sentence more tightly than I should have. Around that same time, subtle things began happening at home. Things I didn't see directly, but felt through conversations that didn't quite add up. Jason mentioned decorations in the background during one of our calls. My mother brushed it off as just cleaning. A few days later, she asked me if I thought 21 was a big deal. I said it depended on the person. She hummed in response, distracted. I didn't push. I never did. My focus was on finals. I was wrapping up a capstone project that had taken months of research. I was preparing a presentation for my internship supervisor. I was coordinating my move to Chicago, comparing apartment listings, calculating deposits, measuring distances in miles instead of emotions. Every night ended the same way, exhausted, hopeful, quietly proud. I imagined my graduation day unfolding calmly. I imagined my mother sitting somewhere in the audience scanning the stage the way parents do, waiting for a familiar face. I imagined the relief of seeing her there, proof that for once I mattered enough to show up for. I didn't need a party. I didn't need gifts. I just needed presence. Looking back, the warning signs were there. I just didn't recognize them as warnings because I had spent my entire life explaining things away. When my mother said she might come later instead of arriving early, I told myself traffic could be bad. When she mentioned she was busy that weekend, I assumed it was work. When she avoided confirming plans, I interpreted it as stress. I had trained myself to be reasonable at my own expense. The truth is, the party was already in motion. While I was submitting final papers and printing resumes, vendors were being booked, balloons were being ordered, a venue was being confirmed, music playlists were being curated. My money, my carefully saved, carefully planned future was already being converted into something loud, temporary, and visible. I didn't know because no one thought I needed to know. From my mother's perspective, there was no conflict. Jason's 21st birthday was important. My graduation was symbolic. One deserved celebration. The other could be acknowledged later. That logic only works when you've already decided whose milestones count. The week before graduation, I called home to finalize details. I asked directly if she had booked her travel. There was a pause on the line, not long enough to raise alarms, but long enough to feel wrong. "I'm still working it out," she said. "You know how things are." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Old habit. "I understand," I replied. I always replied that way. The night before graduation, my roommate helped me steam my gown. We laid everything out on the bed cap tassel program. It felt ceremonial, almost sacred. 4 years reduced to fabric and paper. I texted my mother a photo. She responded with a heart emoji and said, "You look great. I'm proud of you." I went to sleep believing her. Graduation morning arrived quietly. I woke up early, showered, dressed, checked my phone. No missed calls, no updates, no change in plans. I walked across campus, surrounded by families taking photos, parents adjusting collars, siblings complaining about the heat. I searched faces instinctively, even though I told myself not to expect anything. When I found my seat, I looked toward the audience. The rows blurred together. I told myself she was probably running late, that she'd slip in just in time. The ceremony began. Names were called. Applause rose and fell like waves. Time stretched strangely the way it does when you're waiting for something specific. When my name was finally announced, I stood, crossed the stage, shook a stranger's hand, and smiled for a camera that would later send the photo to an email address my mother had access to. I scanned the audience one last time. The seat I had imagined her in was empty. I didn't cry. I didn't falter. I walked back to my seat and sat down, hands folded, face calm. Years of practice had taught me how to keep disappointment contained. It wasn't until later, after the ceremony, after the congratulations from classmates, after the polite hugs, that I saw the first photo. It appeared on social media while I was still in my gown. Bright decorations. A banner with Jason's name. Balloons in colors I didn't recognize. Tables covered in food I knew we never splurged on. And there, in the background of one photo, smiling widely, was my mother. The timestamp told me everything I needed to know. The party hadn't been an afterthought. My graduation hadn't been forgotten. A choice had been made, and I was never part of it. I didn't confront my mother right away. That surprises people when I tell this story, but it shouldn't. Confrontation had never been my instinct. I had been trained carefully over years to doubt my reactions before questioning anyone else's behavior. I told myself I was tired, emotional, that maybe I was misinterpreting what I'd seen. After all, photos don't tell the whole story. Accounts make mistakes. Timelines can overlap accidentally. That was the version of reality I tried to live in for the rest of graduation day. I attended the post-ceremony brunch with classmates. I hugged professors who had guided me through breakdowns and breakthroughs alike. I smiled for photos I would later delete. I answered the same question. "Where's your family?" with the same vague response. They couldn't make it. It was easier than explaining. That night back in my apartment, the quiet finally caught up to me. My roommate had left to celebrate with her parents. I sat on the edge of my bed in my wrinkled gown and opened my laptop, telling myself I was just checking logistics for the move. Instead, I logged into my bank account. The page loaded slowly, as if giving me time to prepare. When the numbers appeared, my brain rejected them before my heart did. The balance was wrong. At first, I thought I was looking at the wrong account. I refreshed the page, checked again, then again. I pulled up my spreadsheet and compared the numbers line by line as if logic could argue with what I was seeing. Over $18,000 gone. Not pending, not delayed, withdrawn. My chest tightened in a way that felt unfamiliar and sharp. I scrolled through the transaction history with shaking hands. The dates jumped out immediately. Multiple withdrawals over the past 2 weeks. Transfers, vendor payments, cash advances. Each line felt like a small betrayal. The timestamps overlapped with my finals, with my graduation. With the party photos I'd just seen, there was no accident here, no misunderstanding, no bank error, I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, trying to breathe evenly. I told myself not to panic, that I needed information before emotion, that there had to be an explanation that didn't make everything I believed about my family collapse. I picked up my phone and called my mother. She answered on the third ring, cheerful and relaxed, like someone who had nothing to hide. "Hey, honey," she said. "Did you get home okay?" I swallowed. "I checked my account," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "A lot of money is missing." There was a pause, longer than the others. "Oh," she said finally. That, one word, heavy, dismissive, that I repeated. "Yes," she replied. "I used some of it, temporarily." My hands tightened around the phone. "Used it for what?" "For Jason's party," she said, as if explaining something obvious. "It was his 21st. It was important." The words didn't land all at once. They arrived slowly, each one cutting deeper than the last. "You took my graduation money," I said. It didn't sound like a question. She sighed. "Emily, don't make it sound so dramatic. You weren't using it right away. And Jason needed this now." Needed. I felt something inside me go very still. "I needed it," I said quietly. "It was for my move. For rent. You knew that." "You'll be fine," she replied quickly. "You always are. You're good with money. You'll make it back." There it was, the sentence I had heard my entire life, finally weaponized. "I didn't ask," she continued, "because I knew you'd understand, and I didn't want you to stress during finals." My mouth went dry. "You didn't ask because you knew I wouldn't say no." She didn't deny it. "Why weren't you at my graduation?" I asked. The question slipped out before I could stop it. Another pause. "I couldn't be in two places at once," she said. "Jason would have been devastated if I missed his party." I closed my eyes. "So you chose," I said. "I did what made sense," she replied. "You already have so much going for you." Jason needed a win. A win! I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to demand every dollar back immediately. Instead, I said nothing. Years of conditioning kicked in automatically, pressing my emotions down before they could surface. "I need the money returned," I said finally. She laughed softly like I was being naive. "Emily, it's already spent. Don't be unreasonable." That word unreasonable hit harder than anything else. I ended the call without another word. For a long time, I sat on the floor of my apartment, back against the wall, phone in my lap, staring at nothing. The pain wasn't just financial. It was existential. It was the realization that the role I had been cast in, patient, understanding, silent, had been used to justify something unforgivable. I wasn't angry yet. Anger takes time. What I felt first was clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be smoothed over. This wasn't a family conflict to be absorbed quietly. This was theft, disguised as entitlement. And for the first time in my life, I didn't rush to make it easier for her. I opened a new document on my laptop. I titled it simply, Timeline. I listed dates, transactions, conversations, screenshots, amounts. If silence had taught me how to survive, then documentation would teach me how to stand. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to disappear this time. The days after graduation felt unreal, like I was moving through someone else's life with my own name attached to it. I should have been celebrating. That's what everyone around me was doing, posting photos, tagging family members, writing captions about pride and new beginnings. My phone buzzed constantly with congratulations from classmates and distant relatives. Each message landed softly, and then disappeared, unable to reach the part of me that had gone quiet. I packed my apartment in silence. Boxes lined the walls labeled in black marker, books, kitchen, winter clothes. Each label felt like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep anymore. The Chicago move that had once felt secure now felt fragile, dependent on numbers that no longer existed. I recalculated everything. Security deposit, first month's rent, utilities, transportation, groceries, emergency fund. I opened my spreadsheet and started deleting lines, crossing out buffers, shrinking margins, removing anything that looked like safety. The math was brutal and unforgiving. Without the money, I could still move, but barely. One unexpected expense would send everything collapsing. One delayed paycheck, one medical bill, one mistake. I didn't call my mother again. That, more than anything, marked the shift. In the past, I would have tried to explain myself to make her understand how deeply she'd hurt me. I would have softened my words, blamed stress, found a way to meet her halfway. This time I stayed silent, not out of submission, but out of clarity. Silence, I realized, could be strategic. A few days later, my mother texted as if nothing had happened. "Did you get your diploma in the mail yet? Send me your new address when you can." Jason loved his party. He was so happy. Each message felt like salt pressed into an open wound. I didn't respond. I spent those days gathering myself inch by inch. I read everything I could find about joint accounts, unauthorized withdrawals, and financial consent. I learned the difference between access and permission. I learned how banks documented disputes. I learned what counted as evidence. The more I read, the calmer I became. This wasn't just emotional, it was procedural. I made an appointment with a legal aid clinic on campus, something I'd never imagined doing. The lawyer assigned to me was calm, methodical, and precise. She listened without interrupting. As I explained the situation, my voice steady despite the weight of it. When I finished, she asked one question. "Did you give explicit permission for these withdrawals?" "No," I said. She nodded. "Then this isn't a family disagreement. This is a financial dispute." Hearing it framed that way felt grounding, solid, real. She explained my options carefully. Civil demand, mediation, small claims, documentation, timelines. The words didn't feel threatening. They felt empowering. I walked out of that office lighter than I'd walked in. That evening I sat down and finished packing the last box. I labeled it documents and placed it near the door. Inside were printed bank statements, screenshots, transaction histories, and notes from my consultation. I slid everything into a folder and zipped it shut. It felt like closing a chapter one I hadn't known I was writing. The night before I moved, my mother called. I stared at the screen as it rang, feeling nothing but a distant curiosity. I answered on the last ring. "Emily," she said, her tone cautious now. "Why haven't you been responding? I've been busy," I replied. With what she asked, irritation creeping in. "Planning my move," I said, "and dealing with the consequences of what you did." She scoffed. "You're still on that, yes," I said calmly. "Because it's not over." There was a pause. "Are you seriously holding a grudge over money?" "I'm addressing theft," I corrected. Her voice sharpened. "You're being dramatic. This is family. Family doesn't take without asking," I replied. "Family doesn't skip graduations to throw parties with someone else's savings." She exhaled loudly. "What do you want, Emily?" The question hung between us. For the first time, she sounded unsure. "I want my money returned," I said. "All of it." "That's impossible," she snapped. "It's gone. Then you'll need to figure out how to replace it," I said evenly. "And if I don't," she challenged. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I didn't explain. I'm documenting everything I said, and I'm moving forward. The line went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was different, lower, wary. "You wouldn't," she said. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "You never thought I would," I replied. The call ended shortly after. The next morning, I loaded my car alone. There was no farewell brunch, no hugs, no last-minute advice. Just me, my boxes, and the hum of the engine as I pulled away from the place that had taught me how to endure, but not how to be seen. As the miles stretched out behind me, something inside me shifted. Not into anger, not into bitterness, into resolve. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was claiming something far simpler and far more difficult. Accountability. For the first time in my life, I wasn't adjusting to keep the peace. I wasn't shrinking to make room for someone else's comfort. I was moving forward with facts, evidence, and a quiet certainty that the truth once written down has a way of standing up on its own, and I had never been more ready to let it speak. I arrived in Chicago with a car full of boxes and a future that suddenly felt thinner than it should have been. The city didn't care about my family problems. The traffic moved. The buildings stood tall. People hurried past me on sidewalks, with coffee in hand and purpose in their steps. In a strange way, that indifference was comforting. My pain wasn't special here. It didn't define me. I unpacked slowly, deliberately. Each item I placed felt like a small act of control, proof that I was still moving forward even if the ground beneath me had shifted. Work began immediately. Orientation, introductions, long days of absorbing systems and expectations. I smiled when required, took notes, did my job well. On the surface, nothing was wrong. But at night, when the city quieted and my phone stopped buzzing, the truth resurfaced. That was when the photos appeared. At first, it was just one posted by a distant relative I barely spoke to. Jason, front and center, holding a drink in one hand and grinning like the world owed him something. Behind him, a banner stretched across a rented space. "Happy 21st birthday, Jason." I stared at it longer than I should have. The decorations were expensive, custom, coordinated. Nothing like the modest celebrations we'd grown up with. I scrolled, heart steady but heavy. There were more photos. A DJ booth, catered food laid out on long tables, a cake that looked like it had come from a specialty bakery. Each detail was a line item in my mind, a quiet calculation running beneath the surface. Then I saw my mother. She stood near Jason, arm around his shoulder, smiling broadly. Not the polite smile she wore at school events or work functions. This one was open, proud, present. The timestamp told me everything. The photos were uploaded during my graduation ceremony. Not after, not later that evening, during. I closed the app without commenting, without reacting, without giving anyone the satisfaction of knowing I'd seen it. Instead, I opened my folder labeled Documents and added screenshots. Dates. Times. Visual proof. I wasn't angry, not in the way people expect. I felt something colder, more precise. Validation. For weeks, I had replayed the conversation with my mother in my head, wondering if I'd misunderstood, if I'd exaggerated the overlap, if there was some missing context that softened the blow. The photos erased that doubt completely. This hadn't been an emergency. It hadn't been rushed. It hadn't been unavoidable. It had been planned. That realization didn't break me. It steadied me. Over the next few days, more evidence surfaced organically. A video clip posted by a friend showing the crowd cheering as Jason made a toast. A tagged photo revealing the venue name. A comment thread where someone congratulated my mother for throwing such an amazing party. I saved everything. At work, I remained focused. I delivered assignments on time. I volunteered for additional tasks. I built trust quietly the way I always had. No one there knew what was happening in my personal life, and I kept it that way. Control, I learned, came from separation. My mother, meanwhile, grew restless. She began calling again more frequently now. When I didn't answer, she left voicemails that oscillated between irritation and concern. "Emily, this has gone far enough. You're blowing this out of proportion. We need to talk like adults." I listened to each message once, then archived them. Not deleted, archived. Everything mattered now. One evening, she tried a different approach. She texted, "I'm worried about you. You've always been so sensitive." I stared at that word for a long time. Sensitive. It was the same label she'd used my entire life to dismiss my reactions. Too sensitive. Too emotional. Too much. I typed a response, then erased it. Typed another, then erased that too. Finally, I sent one sentence. "Please communicate in writing from now on." There was no immediate reply. 2 days later, an email arrived. It was long, defensive, carefully worded. She framed the party as a family obligation. She framed the money as shared resources. She framed my reaction as unexpected hostility. What she didn't do was deny the facts. She didn't deny using the money. She didn't deny missing my graduation. She didn't deny knowing the dates overlapped. I printed the email and added it to the folder. The legal aid lawyer responded promptly when I forwarded the materials. Her reply was short and reassuring. "This strengthens your case." Those 4 words carried more comfort than anything my mother had said in weeks. That weekend, I sat alone in my apartment, the city humming softly outside, and organized everything chronologically. Bank statements, emails, screenshots, social media posts, notes from phone calls. Dates and times aligned neatly, telling a story that no one could interrupt or talk over. For the first time, my silence wasn't empty. It was structured. I thought about Jason, not with anger, but with clarity. He hadn't asked where the money came from. He hadn't questioned why my mother wasn't at my graduation. He hadn't reached out afterward. He'd accepted the celebration without asking who paid for it. That hurt, but it also simplified things. This wasn't about sibling rivalry. It was about accountability. A week later, I sent my mother a formal written demand. It was brief, professional, specific. Amount owed, deadline, consequences if unmet. I didn't accuse. I didn't insult. I didn't explain my feelings. I let the facts speak. Her response came within hours. "This is unnecessary. You're humiliating me. You're tearing this family apart." I read the message once, then placed it neatly behind the others. Families aren't torn apart by truth. They're revealed by it. As the deadline approached, I felt a strange calm settle in. I had done everything I could without raising my voice or lowering my standards. Whatever happened next would not be because I hadn't tried hard enough. I went to bed that night, knowing something fundamental had changed. I was no longer the person waiting to be chosen. I was the one setting terms. And whether my mother realized it yet or not, the story she thought she could control was already slipping out of her hands one document at a time. The confrontation didn't happen in person, and it didn't happen all at once. It unfolded the way everything else in my life had, with restraint, patience, and a quiet refusal to be pulled into chaos. After I sent the formal demand, I expected my mother to escalate. I expected angry calls, accusations, maybe even threats. What I didn't expect was how carefully she tried to rewrite the story. She sent another email 2 days later. This one was calmer, softer. She said she was hurt by my tone, that she felt blindsided, that she never imagined I would involve outsiders in what she considered a private family matter. I read it slowly, line by line. She talked about sacrifice, about how much she had done for me over the years, about how she had always supported my education, a statement that carefully avoided mentioning how much of that support had come from my own labor and scholarships. She never said the words, "I'm sorry." She never said I shouldn't have taken it. Instead, she proposed a conversation, just the two of us over the phone. She said misunderstandings happened when things were put in writing. She said tone was hard to read. She said she missed me. I understood exactly what she was doing. Phones leave no record. Emotion blurs details. I replied with one sentence, "I'm comfortable continuing in writing." Her response took longer this time. When it came, it was sharp. "So you're really doing this," she wrote. "After everything I've done for you." I stared at the screen, my chest tight but my hands steady. In the past, that sentence would have sent me spiraling into guilt, into explanations, into apologies for emotions I was never allowed to have. This time I didn't explain. I responded with facts. I restated the amount. I restated the dates. I restated the deadline. Nothing more. That seemed to unsettle her more than anger ever could. She called again that night. I let it ring. Then she texted, "You're being cold. You've changed. I don't recognize you anymore." I almost smiled. Because she was right. I had changed. Not into something cruel or ungrateful, but into someone who no longer volunteered to be misunderstood. The next morning, I received a message from my aunt, my mother's older sister. She said my mother was distraught, that she didn't understand why I was making this public, that Jason was confused and hurt, that I should consider how this might affect the family. I read the message twice, then set my phone down. This too was familiar. The widening circle, the quiet pressure. The expectation that I would absorb the discomfort so others wouldn't have to feel it. I replied politely. "This is a financial matter between my mother and me. I'm handling it appropriately." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't share details. Boundaries I was learning didn't need justification. A few days later, my mother tried a new angle. She offered partial repayment. Not in writing at first. She mentioned it in a voicemail I saved but didn't return. Then, when I didn't respond, she followed up by email. "I can send you some money now," she wrote. "The rest will take time. You have to understand parties cost more than people think." I read that sentence 3 times. She wasn't offering repayment because she accepted responsibility. She was offering it because she wanted the pressure to ease, because she wanted the situation to quiet down without actually being resolved. I forwarded the email to the legal aid lawyer. Her response was immediate. "Partial repayment without an agreement can complicate things. Do not accept unless terms are documented." I thanked her and replied to my mother, "Any repayment must be in full or outlined in a formal agreement. Please confirm how you intend to proceed." Her reply came hours later. "I don't see why you're making this so difficult." That sentence used to define my role in the family. Whenever I asked for clarity, I was difficult. Whenever I asked for fairness, I was dramatic. Whenever I asked to be considered, I was ungrateful. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on preparing for the next step. The legal aid clinic helped me draft a concise timeline and a summary of evidence. We reviewed bank policies. We discussed jurisdiction. We talked through what a public setting might look like, not a spectacle, but a formal process where facts mattered more than feelings. I felt nervous, but not afraid. Because for the first time, I wasn't walking into a conversation alone. I had structure. I had support. I had documentation. My mother sensed the shift. Her messages grew shorter, more guarded. She asked fewer questions and made fewer demands. It was as if she finally realized that the version of me she could overwhelm with emotion was no longer available. One evening, she sent a message that stood out from the rest. "I never thought you'd do this to me." I typed a response slowly. "I never thought you'd do it to me either." I didn't send it. Some truths don't need to be delivered. They land on their own. As the date for formal action approached, I felt a surprising sense of peace. Not because the situation was resolved, it wasn't, but because I had stopped trying to control how others perceived me. I had spent my life being careful not to upset anyone, not to ask too much, not to take up space. Now I was taking up exactly as much space as the truth required. The confrontation, I realized, wasn't about raising my voice or forcing an apology. It was about refusing to accept a version of events that erased me. And whether my mother ever admitted it or not, she knew something had shifted. Because silence no longer protected her. It protected me. I didn't rush into action. That was the part people misunderstood later, when they asked why I hadn't gone straight to court or made a scene. They assumed restraint meant hesitation. It didn't. It meant preparation. After weeks of documenting, organizing, and refusing to be pulled into emotional arguments, I finally felt ready to turn silence into something else, something structured, undeniable, and permanent. The legal aid lawyer helped me understand the difference between reacting and proceeding. Reaction is loud. Proceeding is deliberate. We reviewed everything one final time. Bank statements, showing each withdrawal listed by date and amount. Screenshots of social media posts with visible timestamps. Emails where my mother acknowledged using the money. Voicemails saved and transcribed. My written demand and her responses, each piece alone might have been brushed aside. Together they formed a timeline that didn't argue. It simply existed. The lawyer explained the next step, a formal filing that would trigger mediation first, followed by a hearing if no agreement was reached. It would be public. Not in the sense of spectacle, but in the sense that records would be created and statements would be made under obligation, not emotion. I nodded as she spoke, my hands folded neatly in my lap. "Are you ready for that?" she asked. I thought about the empty seat at my graduation, the party photos, the word unreasonable. "Yes," I said, "I am." The notice was sent the following week. I didn't announce it. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't give my mother a final chance to explain herself privately. That window had closed when she chose convenience over consent. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Jason. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Emily," he said, his voice uncertain. "Mom says you're taking legal action." "I am," I replied calmly. There was a pause. She said, "It's about the party, that you're upset." "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm addressing what happened." He sighed. "You could have just talked to us." "I did," I said. "I was ignored." "That's not fair," he protested weakly. "Mom didn't mean I stopped him gently. This isn't about intent. It's about facts." Another pause. I could hear him shifting, uncomfortable. "I didn't know the money was yours," he said finally. I believed him, or at least I believed he'd never asked. "I know," I replied, "but now you do." "What happens next?" he asked. "There will be mediation," I said. "If that doesn't work, a hearing." "And Mom?" he asked quietly. "She'll have the opportunity to respond," I said. "Just like I did." He didn't argue after that. He just said I didn't want it to go this far. "Neither did I replied and meant it. After the call, I felt lighter, not vindicated, not triumphant, but unburdened. I hadn't attacked him. I hadn't blamed him. I'd simply stated the truth. At work, I requested a day off for the mediation. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. My manager approved it without question. For the first time, I noticed how different professional respect felt from familial obligation. One required clarity, the other demanded silence. The mediation was scheduled in a neutral building downtown. A simple room, a long table, no raised voices, no audience. My mother arrived late. She looked smaller than I remembered, tired, defensive. She avoided my eyes as she sat down. When she finally looked at me, her expression wasn't angry, it was incredulous, as if she still couldn't believe I'd followed through. The mediator explained the process calmly. Ground rules, turn-taking, documentation. My mother spoke first. She talked about misunderstanding, about family dynamics, about stress, about how she'd never imagined this would become such a big thing. When it was my turn, I didn't respond to her words. I responded to the timeline. I walked through each transaction, each date, each overlap. I referenced her emails, quoting them directly. I described the impact not emotionally but practically. Missed deposits, increased risk, loss of security. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I explained. The room was quiet when I finished. The mediator asked my mother to respond. She looked flustered now. Her explanations began to contradict each other. First, she said she thought I wouldn't need the money immediately. Then she said she assumed I'd be fine without it. Then she said she believed the account gave her the right. The mediator stopped her gently. Access does not equal permission, he said. Do you have written consent? My mother said nothing. That silence was louder than anything I could have said. The mediation ended without resolution. My mother refused to commit to full repayment within a reasonable time frame. She insisted I was being inflexible. I insisted on accountability. We moved to the next step. The hearing date was set. Word traveled fast after that. Relatives reached out cautiously. Some asked questions. Others offered opinions I didn't ask for. I responded to none of it. I had learned by then that clarity doesn't require consensus. The day of the hearing arrived with surprising calm. It was held in a public building open to observers. The room wasn't large, but it felt weighty, formal, real. When my case was called, I stood and spoke clearly. I presented my documents, answered questions directly. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. My mother's attorney attempted to frame the situation as a family disagreement. The judge interrupted him gently. This is not a matter of feelings, she said. This is a matter of funds. Those words landed like a final confirmation. When my mother was asked to speak, she looked at me again. For the first time, her expression held something like fear, not of punishment, but of exposure. She answered as best she could. But facts don't bend easily. When the judge asked her why she hadn't attended my graduation, the room went very still. She hesitated, then said I had another obligation. The judge glanced at the evidence, the timestamps, the photos. And that obligation was funded by the plaintiff's money, she asked. Yes, my mother admitted quietly. I didn't react. I didn't look at her. I had already won something far more important than the outcome. I had been heard. The judge didn't rule immediately. That surprised me more than anything else. After weeks of preparation, documentation, and finally speaking in a room where my words couldn't be dismissed or reframed, I expected a swift conclusion, a decision, a number, an order. Instead, the judge leaned back slightly, folded her hands, and said she would review the materials before issuing a ruling. Given the evidence presented, she said, her voice, even this court will reconvene. The gavel didn't slam. The room didn't erupt. People simply stood and filed out. My mother left quickly, surrounded by quiet murmurs from her attorney. She didn't look at me as she passed. Jason wasn't there. No family members were. I was alone in the hallway afterward, holding a folder that felt lighter than it had all morning. Because something had shifted. Not legally yet, but socially. Public spaces change people. In that courtroom, my mother hadn't been a parent explaining herself to a daughter. She'd been a defendant answering questions from a judge. The language was different. The posture was different. The power dynamic had changed. And she knew it. In the days that followed, the messages stopped. No calls. No texts, no emails from my mother, my aunt, or anyone else who had once tried to convince me I was being unreasonable. The silence this time wasn't strategic, it was stunned. At work, I focused on projects with renewed clarity. I found myself thinking less about what had happened and more about what was coming next. My manager noticed the shift. During a one-on-one, he told me I'd been doing exceptionally well and asked if I'd consider leading a small client initiative. I accepted. Stability, I realized, doesn't come from avoiding conflict. It comes from surviving it intact. 2 weeks later, the court issued its decision. I received the notification by email while sitting at my desk. I didn't open it right away. I finished what I was doing, closed my laptop, took a deep breath. Then I read. The ruling was clear. The court found that my mother had withdrawn and spent funds without explicit consent. The joint account, while granting access, did not grant ownership. The evidence, including her written admissions and the documented overlap with my graduation, supported my claim. She was ordered to repay the full amount, plus fees. The timeline for repayment was firm, non-negotiable, enforceable. I didn't feel joy when I reached the end of the document. I felt relief, not because I'd won, but because the truth had finally been acknowledged in a way no one could talk over. The enforcement process began immediately. Formal notices, deadlines, consequences clearly outlined. My lawyer walked me through each step with the same calm professionalism she'd shown from the beginning. "This is where people often feel guilt," she said gently. "Don't." I nodded. I understood. My mother contacted me that night. For the first time since the hearing, she called directly. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was different now, strained, controlled, careful. "So," she said, "you got what you wanted?" "No," I replied. "I got what was mine." She exhaled sharply. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to me?" "Yes," I said. "I do." There was a long pause. "I never thought it would come to this," she said, finally. "Neither did I," I replied. "That's why I asked you to return it." "You embarrassed me," she said, her voice cracking. "In front of strangers." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I told the truth, I said. What happened after that wasn't my decision. She said nothing. When she spoke again, it wasn't anger. I heard it was something closer to loss. "You could have just let it go," she said quietly. I closed my eyes. "I did that my entire life," I replied. This time I didn't. The call ended shortly after. Word spread quickly after the ruling. Not loudly, not dramatically, but efficiently. Relatives who had once stayed silent now reached out cautiously. Some apologized. Some didn't mention the case at all, opting instead for awkward check-ins that avoided specifics. Jason sent a brief message saying he was sorry things turned out this way. I thanked him, nothing more. I didn't feel the need to explain myself anymore. The repayment process unfolded over the following weeks. Each installment arrived on schedule, documented and final. With every confirmation, a small piece of my nervous system relaxed. Not because I needed the money, though I did, but because each payment represented acknowledgement. Not love, not remorse, responsibility. I moved the funds into a new account under my name only. No shared access, no assumptions, just clarity. One evening after the final payment cleared, I walked along the Chicago River as the sun dipped behind the buildings. The city glowed in that quiet way it does at dusk, golden, reflective, indifferent. I thought about my graduation again, about the empty seat, the photos, the day that had once felt like a loss. It didn't feel that way anymore, because something far more lasting had happened since then. I had learned that justice doesn't always look like an apology. Sometimes it looks like paperwork, deadlines, public accountability, a judge who asks the right question at the right moment. And sometimes the biggest mistake someone makes isn't choosing a party over a graduation. It's assuming the person who stayed silent would always stay that way. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, quietly, the way real accountability usually does, without drama, without shouting, without the satisfaction of watching someone fall apart in front of you. After the ruling, my mother didn't suddenly become apologetic. She didn't send long messages asking for forgiveness or trying to explain herself in new ways. Instead, she became careful. Careful with her words, careful with her tone, careful with me. That shift was telling. For the first time in my life, she wasn't speaking from authority. She was speaking from caution. The repayments came exactly as ordered. Each one arrived on schedule, transferred with clinical precision. No notes, no explanations, just numbers, moving back where they belonged. I documented every payment anyway, not because I didn't trust the system, but because I had learned never to trust assumptions again. Jason reached out again after the second payment cleared. His message was short and awkward. "I didn't realize how serious this was," he wrote. "I'm sorry." I read it carefully before replying. "I know," I said. "Take care of yourself." That was all. I wasn't angry with him. Anger would have implied expectations I no longer held. What I felt instead was distance, clean, necessary distance. At work, things continued to improve. I was given more responsibility. My name appeared on internal reports. People listened when I spoke in meetings. Not because I demanded attention, but because I had learned how to speak without apologizing for existing. It struck me one afternoon during a quiet moment at my desk that this was what being seen actually felt like. Not praise, not validation, recognition. The legal process had ended, but its impact rippled outward in ways I hadn't anticipated. Relatives began treating me differently, not warmly, not coldly, but carefully. Conversations changed tone when I joined them. Questions were phrased more thoughtfully. No one joked about me being easygoing anymore. That version of me had been officially retired. My mother and I spoke rarely after that. When we did, it was brief and functional. No emotional probing. No guilt-laced comments. No attempts to rewrite history. One evening, months after the final payment cleared, she called unexpectedly. I hesitated before answering, then picked up. "How are you?" she asked. "I'm well," I replied. A pause followed. The old pattern would have filled it with explanations or justifications. This time, it remained empty. "I didn't think you would go through with it," she said quietly. I didn't respond right away. "That's what hurt the most," she continued, "realizing I was wrong about you." I took a slow breath. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I said. "I did it because I needed to stand up for myself." "I know," she replied, though her voice suggested she was still catching up to that truth. We ended the call without resolution, without warmth, without hostility. It was enough. The absence of chaos felt like progress. As time passed, the story began to lose its emotional weight. It became something I remembered, rather than something I carried. The money returned to my account, but more importantly, my sense of agency settled into place. I stopped second-guessing my instincts, stopped softening my boundaries, stopped explaining my decisions to people who hadn't earned the explanation. One weekend, I finally framed my graduation photo, the one sent by the university. In it, I'm smiling on stage, diploma in hand, alone in the frame. For a long time, I had avoided that image. It reminded me of what was missing. Now I saw something else. I saw a woman standing on her own. The irony wasn't lost on me. The moment my mother skipped the one she had treated as optional had become the foundation for everything that followed. Not because of the ceremony itself, but because of what its absence revealed. It showed me exactly where I stood, and once I knew that I was free, I didn't repair the relationship with my mother. I didn't destroy it either. I let it become what it was capable of being and nothing more. Time has a way of softening the sharpest memories, not by erasing them, but by placing them in context. Months passed after everything was resolved. The court documents were filed away. The bank statements stopped updating. The tension that had once lived in my chest loosened its grip, replaced by something steadier and quieter. Peace didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived in small, almost unnoticeable ways. It arrived the first time I made a financial decision without fear. It arrived the first time I said no without explaining why. It arrived the first time I realized I no longer checked my phone after talking to my mother, bracing for fallout. My life in Chicago took shape slowly. I settled into my job, signed a new lease with confidence, and built routines that belonged only to me. Morning walks, evening reading, grocery lists that reflected my preferences, not anyone else's expectations. For the first time, my life felt aligned. I didn't reconnect with my mother in the way people like to imagine in stories like this. There was no tearful reunion, no heartfelt confession, no moment where everything finally made sense between us. Instead, there was clarity. We spoke occasionally on neutral ground about neutral things. Weather, health, logistics. The conversations were polite and distant, like two people who shared history but no longer shared assumptions. And that was okay. Because reconciliation isn't always about closeness. Sometimes it's about honesty, about accepting what a relationship can and cannot be. I stopped waiting for her to become someone else. I stopped hoping she would one day understand the depth of what she had done. Understanding, I learned, is not a prerequisite for healing. Acceptance is. Jason and I drifted further apart, not out of hostility, but because our lives moved in different directions. He never mentioned the party again. I never asked him to. Some silences don't need to be broken to be acknowledged. What surprised me most was how often people, especially women, reached out after hearing my story. Quiet messages, late-night texts, carefully worded emails. I thought I was the only one. I always wondered if I was overreacting. I've been the easy one, too. They weren't asking for advice. They weren't looking for instructions. They just wanted to know that someone else had stood up and survived. I never told them to do what I did. Everyone's circumstances are different, but I told them the truth. That silence is powerful, but only when it protects you, not when it erases you. That patience is admirable, but not when it becomes permission. That love should never require you to disappear. The biggest lesson didn't come from the courtroom or the ruling. It came from the moment I stopped asking myself, Am I allowed to be hurt? And started asking, what do I need to feel whole? Those are very different questions. I realized that for most of my life, I had been living as if my needs were negotiable, something to be postponed, minimized, or justified. I had mistaken endurance for virtue and silence for maturity. Standing up for myself didn't make me cruel. It didn't make me ungrateful. It didn't make me difficult. It made me honest. And honesty, I learned, is not loud. It doesn't demand attention. It simply refuses to bend around other people's comfort. When I look back now at my graduation, the empty seat, the missed moment, I don't feel the same ache I once did. That day marked the end of one version of my life and the beginning of another. Not the version where I was finally chosen, but the version where I chose myself. There is a quiet dignity in that kind of ending. No applause, no celebration, just the knowledge that you stood still long enough to let the truth catch up. If you're listening to this and you see yourself somewhere in my story, if you've been the patient one, the understanding one, the one who always adjusts, I hope you take this with you. You don't need to be louder to matter. You don't need permission to protect yourself. And you don't need to disappear to keep the peace. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand exactly where you are and say nothing until the truth speaks for you. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share where you're listening from and what part stayed with you the most. And if you believe in quiet strength and delayed justice, consider subscribing. Some stories don't end loudly, but they end right. There's a quiet power in that choice. I stopped performing gratitude, stopped proving resilience, stopped carrying responsibility that was never mine. People sometimes ask if I regret taking it as far as I did. I don't. Because regret implies doubt, and I don't doubt myself anymore. Justice didn't come with an apology or a tearful reconciliation. It came with acknowledgement boundaries and a public record that said clearly and without ambiguity that what happened to me was wrong. That was enough. I didn't win by being louder. I didn't win by humiliating anyone. I didn't win by demanding love that was never offered. I won by refusing to disappear. And in doing so, I learned something I wish I had known much earlier. Silence can be strength, but only when it's a choice.